Good afternoon. I'm Alan Solomont, the Dean of Tufts University's Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Civic Life Lunch with former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Michèle Flournoy. I want to thank the Fletcher School for co-sponsoring today's conversation and for providing us an expert moderator in Professor Monica Duffy-Toft, who will be in conversation with Ms. Flournoy. We are privileged to welcome our guest, the former Undersecretary and Professor Toft, as part of Tisch College's lineup of spring speakers. This semester, we've already hosted civic leaders like Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, Stacey Abrams, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Fox News anchor Chris Wallace, and former Agriculture Secretary Dan Glickman. We're looking forward next week to chatting with Congresswoman Lauren Underwood and former Republican National Committee Chair Michael Steele. You can go to tischcollege.tufts.edu/events for dates and details for these and other talks this semester. Our guest today is one of the country's leading experts on defense policy and national security. Michèle Flournoy is the co-founder and managing partner of WestExec Advisors, a strategic advisory firm she launched in 2017. From 2009 to 2012, she served as the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, where she was the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and in National Security Council deliberations. Michèle co-founded the Center for a New American Security, a bipartisan think tank dedicated to developing strong, pragmatic national security policies. She served as president of the center until 2009 and later returned as CEO in 2014. She now serves on its board. For several years, Michèle was senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and prior to that, she was a distinguished research professor at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. During the Clinton administration, Michèle served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Threat Reduction and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy. The editor of several books and the author of dozens of reports and articles on a range of defense and national security issues, Michèle is the recipient of many honors and awards, including the American Red Cross Exceptional Service Award, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's Joint Distinguished Civilian Service Award, and the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. Currently, she's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Aspen Strategy Group, and she is a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Moderating today's conversation with Michèle Flournoy is Professor Monica Duffy-Toft. An expert in international security, Monica is a professor of international politics and director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School here at Tufts University. She also serves as a research associate at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford and at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, as a supernumerary fellow at Oxford's Brasenose College, as a global scholar at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Before joining Fletcher, Professor Toft taught at Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government and at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. While at Harvard, she directed the Initiative on Religion in International Affairs and was the assistant director of the John M. Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. She has a master's degree and a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Prior to her academic career, she spent 4 years in the United States Army as a Russian linguist. Thank you, Professor Toft, for leading today's conversation, and thank you to our guest, Michèle Flournoy, for joining us this afternoon. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Toft.
Thank you, Dean Solomons, and I'm delighted to be here today. The person that we have before us is an extraordinary career, and Michelle, I welcome you, and I'm delighted that you and I can have a conversation. And it's interesting because you listen to those bios, and you and I, our careers have tracked very differently, but we're both sort of children of the Cold War, and so I think I'd like to start there with the Cold War. I'm paradoxically back in favor as a Russian linguist, and you started your early part of your career looking at nuclear weapons and was a sort of a policy expert in that area. And so how did that influence sort of your career as you moved forward, starting as a sort of a child of the Cold War, and then going into defense and national security policy and becoming one of the world's leading experts in this issue? So I thought it'd be fun for you to discuss sort of the early parts of your career, and in particular the nuclear situation.
Sure. So, well, first of all, thanks for hosting me. Really looking forward to the conversation with students. So I did come of age in the middle of the Cold War. When I was at Oxford, I ended up writing my master's thesis on the ethics of nuclear deterrence. When I came out of Oxford, back then there was no internet, there was no email. So, I sent lots of airmail letters across the pond to try to find work in Washington, D.C., and ended up starting in the think tank world there. And the advice I got very early on was, you've got to pick something you're passionate about, and then go deep, really make yourself an expert in something. And so for me, that was nuclear weapons bean counting, it was arms control treaties, it was nuclear proliferation. And that's really the focus area that I spent the first 8 years of my career. And then, based on, studying and writing and publishing in that field, when I had the opportunity to go into government for the first time, that was an opportunity to broaden, to cover a much larger range of issues. But I did, in fact, start in trying to, earn my membership card in the nuclear priesthood of the arms control priesthood, I should say, which at the time was, kind of the place to be in U.S. national security in that environment in that time.
Yeah. So to continue that thread, it's interesting because people don't talk about nuclear weapons as wholeheartedly as they did, let's say, in the 70s and the 80s. And
probably a good thing.
Pardon?
Probably
a good thing. But they're not talking about the treaties, or the treaties aren't being we're worried about sort of the current treaties and whether they're going to be respected. And we've got START 2 and we have China coming on board, and of course, North Korea. So where do you see us today, sort of when it comes to the nuclear balance, when it comes to deterrence? Do you think we're in a pretty safe sort of environment, given your expertise and how you're sort of watching over the horizon?
Yes and no. I think that when you look at the declared nuclear powers, there are certainly investments that Russia is making on the margins and new capabilities, and they continue to modernize quite aggressively. There's modest growth and modernization in the Chinese arsenal. But I think the nuclear weapons are in the background of these relationships, not in the foreground. And I think that's the real change. When mid-1980s, you had real nuclear saber rattling, open sort of public saber rattling between Gorbachev and Reagan at the time. So the good news is nuclear weapons are more in the background. But I do think there are a number of other countries that are seeking to join the club. Obviously, there are undeclared states like Israel, like Pakistan, India, and others, but also North Korea and Iran working hard at this as well. So I think the proliferation issues, preventing that, managing it where we must, those are very important issues going forward. And I think that we have to be thinking about how to maintain strategic stability with Russia, with China, not only from a nuclear perspective, but from the perspective of all the different capabilities and of things that can touch that strategic stability, including things like cyber weapons or hypersonics or other types of technologies.
Yeah, and I'd like to touch upon those, but maybe we'll do that a little bit later. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. And you are known and have an extraordinary reputation as somebody who really thinks about talent and honing talent. I know we have a large number of students on board, and a number of them would like to go into civil service, but we know fewer are going in, and we know that the civil service, we have a lot of retirements happening. So there may be a crisis at some point if we don't have enough of our young folks going in. So the question is how do we make it more attractive, and how do we invest so that we have a very strong civil servant pool and can cultivate that civilian expertise of the next generation?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to know what we're aiming for. And I think what we're aiming for is a national security cadre that actually looks like the American people that they are sworn to serve. We all take an oath when you enter public service. We all, you take an oath to the Constitution. We want to we have an incredible diversity of talent and lived experience in this country. It's to our benefit to leverage that, because it's not only from a moral, right thing to do perspective, but all the business literature says that when you have more diverse teams in place, you get higher performing organizations and better quality of decision making. So why would we leave any of that talent on the table? In terms of making it more attractive, I do think government has a lot of modernizing how it does business. The most backward part of the government is the business side of the enterprise, the processes, how we manage people, how we manage, acquisition and so forth. So there's a lot of updating and modernization that needs to be done. And frankly, I think some of the models need to be adapted. For example, civil service. There are very few young people these days who want to make a 30-year commitment to a career. But if you designed a career path that would enable them to come in and out of government more freely, or maybe have a government base, but also do tours of duty in other sectors that would augment their skills and their perspective and what they bring to the table, maybe that would be a way to attract more. So, and then we have to remove the barriers to some of the diversity I've talked about. It's just harder to retain women and people of color in many of the agencies. That's been very well documented. And there are things that need to change in order for that not to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when I was at the Kennedy School in the 1990s and then moved to Oxford and now at Fletcher, I've always been at schools of public policy. And there was a crisis that we felt because our students were not going into public service. But what we discovered is they were going in and out of public service. But you're right, if they wanted a career and sort of make the higher echelons the way you have in public service, it's more difficult. And so that would be great if you could figure out career trajectories so that they could do that more readily so that it doesn't harm their careers. So
I do think there is a model of coming in and out. I mean, that's been the model I've pursued. And if you're going to do that as an appointee, it means that you've got to figure it out that even if you're remarkably successful and you have multiple tours in government, you're still going to spend a lot of your time, if not most of your time, outside government. So you also have to figure out, what is that passion? Is it being in a think tank? Is it being an academic and a professor? Is it, Walt Slocum, my first boss in the Pentagon, was a tax lawyer and he loved tax law when he wasn't in government. So, what is that other base that allows you to come in and out of, and make sure you're passionate about that as well, given how much time you'll spend there.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good advice. And it's a nice segue to the next piece that I wanted to talk to, which is civil military relations. I have a student who's working on a dissertation on it. And, we've had in 2 waivers in the last 2 administrations for the Secretary of Defense. First it was Mattis and now it's Austin. And so should we be concerned about that? You did talk about sort of resetting civil military relations within the Pentagon at one point. Can you explain what you mean by that? Should we be concerned that we don't have as many, let's say, public servants or people within the executive branch with as much military experience, yet we have this paradox that our secretaries of defense, right, have been former military that require these waivers for them to be appointed?
Yeah, no, I think the law that says, the Secretary of Defense should be a civilian except in these, exceptional cases that we will consider a waiver. I think that's appropriate. There are only two civilians in the chain of command in our democracy, and they are the President and the Secretary of Defense. And the last time a waiver had occurred, or not a waiver, last time a retired military officer or general officer had served before Mattis was George C. Marshall. So you had like a 7-year period. I mean, that's a pretty infrequent event. The fact that we've had this happen twice in a row or twice recently is, I don't think, healthy as a long-term trend, right? The civilians and the military professionals, however talented they are, they bring very different things to the table. And that, that leadership at the top really matters in terms of resetting to a healthy place in the relationship more broadly. I think civil-military relations went in some negative directions in the last administration. And it's very, very important to re-empower the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the civilians there to support the civilian oversight functions in the department, because those had been either neglected or had atrophied substantially in the last 4 years. I do think it's possible to reset. I've seen it myself. My first tour you mentioned was in the Clinton administration. I came in when it was Les Aspin as secretary, Colin Powell as chairman. That was a low point, a real nadir in the civil-military relationships, open disrespect and hostility between the civilian and military staffs, really the disrespect coming from the military to the civilians at the time. And then I watched how Bill Perry, when he stepped into the secretary's position and General Shalikashvili stepped in as chairman, literally within a matter of weeks, based on the example they set, the instructions they gave to their staff, and the incentives they put in place so you will now start behaving differently with each other. It changed remarkably quickly, but it took serious leadership on the civilian side and the military side to reset that relationship in a healthy way.
Yeah, because when I think about it, I think about networks and nails, right? Because they may be extraordinarily competent people, obviously, but they're going to bring in their network of people, right? And then nails, when you learn and you train, I think a lot about ethnicity and violence and civil wars. That's what I think about. Whereas, we talk about if there's, one nail and one hammer, right? So the idea is that you're going to think about the use of force and rather than sort of diplomacy or trade or other sort of mechanisms that can sort of help advance U.S. national security. Which gets me to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about. So, just thinking about the Trump administration and national security, and now we've shifted quite dramatically to the Biden administration. And the Trump administration was all about America first. Some people say it was more of an isolationist position. In some ways it was, in other ways it wasn't. What do you think of the big transformations that we're witnessing and are going to likely to continue witness under the Biden administration? And what do you think is positive that came out of the Trump administration that the Biden administration can sort of continue? And what do you think should absolutely be changed as we move forward to enhance U.S. national security?
So I think there's several differences that we're already starting to see in basic approach, even though, if you compare some of the strategy documents, there's a lot of themes like great power competition, the challenge of China and so forth that will be common across the administrations. But in actual practice, first of all, I think you're going to see the Biden administration take a less tactical approach and more of a strategic approach. They're taking time up front to do a series of policy reviews. Classic example is on China, which we may want to go into more depth later. But, Trump was very trade focused, very tactically focused on tariffs and the phase one trade deal and so forth. Whereas Biden is really trying to look at the relationship in a much broader context and the competition across economic, technological, military, and ideological or political dimensions, but also the fact that we're going to have to cooperate with China in key areas like climate change and pandemic prevention, for goodness sake. So more strategic approach. Number two is, I think Biden understands that the foundations of our success overseas really rest on how strong we are here at home. And so focusing on getting COVID under control, focusing on economic recovery, focus on identifying key areas where we need to invest as a nation, not only government, but also private sector, to really keep our competitive edge in key technology areas and so forth. I think that sort of foreign policy starts at home, perspective is a different flavor of that with Biden. The third thing I would note is by, with, and through allies. This belief that we are going to be much more effective in anything we do if we have like-minded countries or countries that share our interests and values alongside us, in pushing back against Chinese aggressive behavior, or in addressing climate change, or in dealing with whatever the challenge is. So I think those are pretty critical changes. I think, I'm hoping that they won't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think there are some evidence of this. For example, the Abraham Accords that were negotiated, between the UAE and Israel, and the discussions with Bahrain and Qatar and others, really sort of moving towards normalizing Israel's relationships with the Gulf states, kind of in exchange for a halt to annexation activities. I think the administration plans to build on that. That's a positive development that Trump should get credit for, and we should build on going forward. So I do think they're sifting through the inheritance, if you will, to figure out what are the nuggets that you actually want to keep and build on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And so why don't we talk about China? I mean, China's a tough one, right? Because you're right, on so many dimensions, we do need their cooperation and in some ways their expertise. I mean, they're ahead in some ways on sort of particularly alternatives to oil and gas for energy supply. So how should the Biden administration be thinking about China? Because we need that balance of pressure, particularly around human rights, but also trade, and then also threatening its neighbors, right? It's building up, these atolls in the region. So if you're, and I'm sure you are, advising the Biden administration, what is the balance there with China? Where do we use carrots, and then where do we use sticks in order to advance our interests?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we need to have a very clear-eyed assessment of our own interests, China's interests, where we can work together, where, it'll be more challenging. I don't think prior frames are very useful. I don't think the notion of Cold War with China is applicable. I don't think containment is the right frame. I don't even think wholesale decoupling is the right frame. What we have to do is really identify in this very multifaceted competition that will obviously take place in the Indo-Pacific, but also in other areas globally, frankly, that, where do we really have skin in the game? Where do we really want to compete? And where can we take kind of a laissez-faire attitude of, fine, let them, invest here or there. It doesn't really touch our interests in any fundamental or important ways. And then where are the things that, no kidding, we really have to be very clear in communicating our resolve and so forth. And then where are the things we can cooperate? Again, I think that the Biden administration is right to try to buy some time. The reason why Alaska, the meeting wasn't a big negotiation, is they're really trying to just do that assessment and buy some time so that we can be recovering from COVID. Our economy can be picking back up. We can be having maybe an infrastructure and technology investment bill under our belts, that we will be on the path to recovery. Because the biggest problem we have right now is that China has actually drunk its own Kool-Aid. They believe their own propaganda about U.S. decline. And that's very dangerous, because if you really believe that the U.S. is irreversibly in decline, that can lead you to a whole set of miscalculations that could bring forward potentially very aggressive actions and could get you into a conflict that actually neither side wants. So we have to be very careful, and we have to they won't listen, but you can show them, as we did after the financial crisis in 2009, that, the U.S. is not, and, we can't count us down and out. We are going to come back. We are going to recover. We're going to address the domestic issues that we need to address. So you have to still contend with us, and you have to count on us showing up. You have to count on us pushing back when you behave badly.
Yeah, and that's interesting about the delay, because it's true. We have a new administration, and they need time to take stock and figure out how they're going to deal with that. And at one point you talked about a period of profound technological disruption, right? And, the United States, we are going to come into a period of recovery from the pandemic. And there may be an opportunity here for investment, perhaps under a new administration, if they can get some budgets and policy passed. So, the Pentagon in particular, if we think about DoD, can make a lot of bets. You've already talked about hypersonic weapons. We could talk about the cyberspace, which is not just a DoD purview. Where should they be thinking about in terms of threats coming not only out of China? We could talk about Russia. We could talk about North Korea, Iran, some of the more, formidable opponents that the U.S. is facing.
Well, I think the identification of big areas where we need to invest really has to follow some strategy or concept for how we're going to deter China. And I think it requires a shift of mindset from thinking in kind of attrition warfare-based terms of, the side that can eliminate more quantities of the other's forces ultimately wins, and think a little bit, frankly, more like our competitors are thinking, which is asymmetrically. How do we undermine their strengths? How do we exploit their vulnerabilities? Because they are going to have quantitative advantages, in their own backyard where we're projecting, we would have to project forces forward. They've made a lot of investments in things like anti-ship missiles and cyber and space anti-satellite, weapons and all kinds of things. So we have to think asymmetrically. And I think, number one, we need to place a big bet on creating the network of networks that allows us to command and control our forces when they do not have domain superiority, when they are going to be under persistent attack, either cyber, electronic, or kinetic. Two, how do we address some of those quantitative disadvantages by teaming manned and unmanned systems, by gaining some advantage of complicating an adversary's planning and approach by putting a lot more unmanned systems controlled by human beings, but a lot more unmanned systems into the battle space, whether it's in the air, on the water, or undersea. And then we need to be using AI to make better decisions faster than the other side, sifting through massive amounts of information, getting the relevant insights, making human decisions more quickly and with better fidelity. And we need to assume that, massing forces is going to be a very bad idea in an anti-access area. And so you're going to have to operate from a much more dispersed set of locations, and often moving from location to location, which proposes all kinds of other logistical and operational challenges. So there just has to be a fundamental reset in our thinking, and then some insight as to the key technologies and capabilities that are going to enable the force to be successful and survivable in that very different environment in the future. You're not going to throw away the military you have. It's a matter of adopting new technologies that adapt what you have to be better in the new set of conditions.
Yeah, and it's not only just China, it's also Russia. President Putin's made it very clear that he wants to be quite disruptive to not only the United States, but to the U.S. and its allies. And, what we're seeing, and Freedom House has, tracked this, the decline in democracies around the world and the rise of anocracies, those in-between states, and then, of course, autocracies. How should we be thinking about that? The Cold War was premised on the communist bloc, the Soviet bloc, versus the Western liberal capitalist bloc. Should we be concerned about this from sort of a defense position, and particularly coming from China, but then also from Russia, and Putin making it quite clear that he doesn't want the Western bloc to stay together?
Yeah, no, I don't think we have to worry about a Russian Chinese alliance in the way that we have a NATO alliance, but I do think we have to worry about them because we've seen it. We'll have to worry about them finding opportunities to cooperate together, to complicate or make, give us some very bad days. I also think that a lot of what this involves is getting other states that share either our interests and or our values to show up with us in international fora that are setting the standards, such as, how we're going to treat data in the future, how we're going to treat, the internet, the standard setting bodies, the rules setting bodies that are constantly evolving or translating into practice the kind of inherited rules-based order from the post-World War II period. China doesn't buy into that order. They would like to dictate new terms, as they have tried to in several instances. I think the US has an interest in keeping that foundation in place and evolving those rules as appropriate to meet the new realities. But we want to do that. The EU shares those interests. They don't want to live under a Chinese system. They should want to live under a Western system, and as do many other partners in Asia and elsewhere. But U.S. leadership's key to bringing that coalition of states together and showing up together in these fora. And that was, I think, one of the areas where we lost the most ground in the last 4 years, because that just wasn't of interest, didn't seem to be of interest to the last administration.
No, and the Biden administration absolutely does seem committed to multilateralism, and in particular to NATO and our allies, which I think is a positive step because we share interests, and it's not just ideologies or ideas, but other sorts of interests, strategic interests. So before we turn it over to the students, actually, I'd like to ask about the students and what sort of advice, the Fletcher School retrained students, many of whom go into the State Department with the School of Law and Diplomacy. Some of them go into private business, and others actually are active duty military service who come to us for a short time and then they go back into their positions. So, what advice would you give them as they're sort of launching the next phase of their careers? And then for the undergraduates in Tisch College and others, as they start their careers, what should they be thinking about?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is come on in, the water's fine. You have been very well prepared, or else you wouldn't be attending this webinar. So at some point in your career, I would just ask that you find a way to serve in some capacity, whether that's military, whether it's federal government, whether it's through the nonprofit sector, but NGOs, but find a way to serve, because there's nothing more rewarding than being part of advancing a mission that serves a greater public good or a greater purpose. That's thing one. The second thing is, if you're early in your career, find something you're really passionate about, not just intellectually interested, but like there's a heart element in it. That's something that you are just passionate about, because that passion is what will sustain you through the ups and downs and over the arc of your career. And so that's very important. The third thing I would say is, when you can, choose the boss, not the job. So I had an opportunity coming into the Pentagon my first time to choose between a job description that literally was the perfect job description. It was basically implementing the Nunn-Luer program, which I had helped work on the kind of intellectual capital for that when I was at Kennedy School as a fellow, versus taking a helping to stand up a new defense strategy office in the Pentagon, which I found terrifying. But it was working for someone named Ted Warner, who was a legendary mentor of young people, and even more unusually at the time, of young women coming into defense. And someone said to me, choose the boss, not the job. You'll never regret it. And sure enough, within 2 years, he made me a DASD. Within 2 more years, I was a PDASD. I mean, it just, the opportunities that he threw at me because he had that priority of developing the people who worked for him was just invaluable. I mean, literally put my career on a trajectory it never would have been otherwise. So find those bosses, those mentors who really will invest in you. And
yeah, no, yeah. No, that's great advice. And since you mentioned, the gender side of things, it is National Women's History Month, and so I mean, you're in a man's world. I think there's no denying that. You study security and defense and national security policy. Do you have any advice for the young women as they're moving forward? We're in the Me Too movement, and we've had some horrific events, recently in Atlanta, and we think that there was a gender or sex component to that. Do you have any advice for women as they're starting their careers or taking that next step?
Don't let the fact that it's a male-dominated area deter you. There has been progress in the 30 years I've been involved. When I first, again, was in the nuclear priesthood, I was always the only woman in the room. There was nobody else at the time, at least at my age and stage. When I first was in the Pentagon, we had a women's lunch, and all 8 of us sat at one table in the dining room, and everybody was staring at it like, why are the women having lunch together? Must be plotting an overthrow of the Pentagon. Now you could fill, literally, at least in the Obama administration, you could have filled the entire dining room with women leaders. So it has gotten better. It's not where it needs to be. But it is getting better. It's certainly not where it needs to be in terms of being fully inclusive of people of color and various lived experience and so forth. But, it's only going to get better having more diverse folks come in. And it does mean that you have to be even better than your colleagues in the sense that you have to be hyper competent and hyper excellent. That's not necessarily fair, but it will, if you are, it will pay off. It will get you noticed, hopefully attract some of those mentors that you want to find. And then it just takes some grit. There are times when you're going to encounter overt bias. And as long as it's not, crossing the line into harassment, oftentimes, the best I found, I didn't want to lose all the energy on someone else's ignorance. And I was like, let it be their problem. And I'm going to show them why I'm here. And do that, go on. And eventually they figure it out. Like, oh, my goodness, I understand. She's not a token. She's not a quota. She is here because she deserves to be here, because she's adding value and making a contribution. So I do think, but everybody has to find their own way of navigating. The other thing I would say is finding, having those women that you have lunch with or those other colleagues that you have lunch with, finding those mentors who you can turn to when it just gets very frustrating. But, persistence and competence and excellence, all of that will serve you well. And I do think it's changing enough now that this sense of it being totally male dominated, by the time that many of you are in the prime of your careers, maybe it won't feel so much like that by then.
Yeah. And eventually she'll be the boss that you want to be, right? You'll be that boss that people want to glom to. So let's turn to the questions. Our first questioner is Haruka.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for taking the time to address our questions and share your insights. I'm Haruka. I'm a senior from Japan studying international relations and psychology at Tufts. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the future of public education in defense and national security.
Public education in defense and national security, or meaning?
Or on the subject of defense and national security.
I actually think that we need to do a better job of sort of helping our young people, almost going back to what we used to call civics, but helping our young people understand how government works, why public service is important, why national defense is important, why, having a strong, globally competitive economy is so important. There's a lot that's been lost in terms of the basics. And so often when you look at some of these opinion polls or you hear folks interviewed on television, you realize that there's a sort of missing element in terms of a basic understanding of these topics. So I think we have to start younger. I certainly would think that by high school, people should be getting exposed to these issues. And I do think that would help create kind of a recruiting pipeline to introduce kids earlier to the notion that, hey, I can actually serve my country, whether it's for a career or maybe it's just a chapter. I mean, we always encouraged our kids, like, start with public service. You don't have to do it your whole career, but if you do it early, you'll at least know what it's like. And then you can choose whether you want to continue or come in and out, or, that was my one experience and I've done my part and that's it. But I think we need to create a more positive and in-depth awareness in order to attract the kind of talent we're going to need to be successful.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. Thank you, Haruka, because Tisch College for Civic Life is the co-sponsor, is the host for this event. And that's what they're trying to do. But I agree, we want it sooner. I mean, a high school education was supposed to have created citizens. And what we're finding is a lot of ignorance. So the next questioner is Robert.
Hi. Really appreciate your remarks today. I'm Robert Delsey. I graduated from Tufts in 2009, studying mechanical engineering, international relations, and Chinese. You discussed making civil service more attractive to new employees and recommending that students go into it. And moving forward from that, I'm interested in what advice you would offer somebody trying to further advance their career in the DoD.
Sure. From a civil service perspective or from anybody who's coming into DoD?
I'm most interested in civil service, but if there's others who might be interested in a different perspective, I wouldn't be opposed.
No, I think we really need to think about, we think a lot more about initial recruitment than we think about how to develop people over time, retain them, and give them meaningful career tracks. We tend to kind of have a one-size-fits-all approach. And you mentioned you're an engineer. I've just written a lot about how do we attract tech talent? In this day and age, yes, we'll still rely on industry to build a lot of the systems that we need in the future, but you need some technical savvy to be able to oversee the setting of the requirements for that system, to oversee its acquisition, to oversee its integration into the force in the field, to actually operate the system at some point. So we need more tech savvy. And the irony is that we recruit tech talent all the time into government, whether it's STEM graduates from ROTC or the military academies, or civilians coming in with technical backgrounds. But then we track them in these career paths that don't allow them to actually leverage that expertise or deepen it or refine it. And so I think having a more flexible talent management approach that really fully leverages the talents that people bring to bear, but B, gives the individual much more choice in managing their own career going forward and breaking out of this sort of one-size-fits-all. And there are some experiments going on in DoD, more on the military side right now, of creating kind of employment marketplaces. So more like a LinkedIn and a way of seeing what's available and making your own choices about what you want to apply to and what you want to compete for, and giving much more agency to the individual to manage their careers in a way that's similar to what you find on the outside. So this is a great example of taking a 1950s business process and bringing it into the 21st century, leveraging the information technology we have to make something like that possible. So stay tuned. I mean, civil service reform is notoriously hard. But I think there are a lot of changes you can make even within the current system, using some of the more flexible authorities that Congress has provided, to make it a more attractive career path for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Are you okay? The next is Asia.
Hi, my name is Asya Mijovic, and I'm a combined degree sophomore studying art and civic studies. I wanted to ask you what led you to become a policymaker.
So I became very interested in all things international from an exchange student experience I had in high school, and then work experiences I had in college, going abroad for summers and such, and then studying international relations. And initially, I was very interested in the ideas and the intellectual capital, if you will, the generation of policy ideas, of new thinking. But at some point, about 8 years in, I really had the itch to sort of I actually want to try to implement some of this stuff. I don't want to just come up with the idea and throw it over the transom and hope that somebody on their side will, catch it and do something with it. I actually want to see what it's like to try to implement this. And that was really part of the impetus to go into government and try that out. And then once I had the experience and the excitement, I was just talking to the ambassador before the webinar started. When you have the experience of taking an idea and actually getting it implemented and changing realities on the ground, it's very rewarding and very exciting, particularly if that change is enduring. And so that's what really, realizing that, you can actually really make a difference, as both, in the developing the ideas, whether you're outside government or in, and then actually implementing them. To me, I think that there's the incredible reward and sense of making a difference there.
Yeah, just following up on Oxia, I apologize for mispronouncing your name, Oxia. So what are you most proud of? I could ask you, what was a stumble and how did you recover? Maybe we could get to that next. But what is a change that you put in place, and how did you do that?
I think the expectation is that I'm going to come up with a policy example. One of the things I was most proud of is we put in place a human capital strategy in the Office of Secretary of Defense that started investing in our people and developing them as professionals. And that had a profound impact on performance, on morale, and became a model for other parts of the department. And in terms of lasting impact and what people come back to me and say, oh my goodness, that was the most amazing thing. It's not the bin Laden raid. It's not which was, consequential, but it's not this or that policy. It is, the impact we had on the people who are still there in the workforce and who had an opportunity to really grow and shine during that period.
Oh, that's interesting. So John, you're next.
Yes, hi, thank you. I graduated from the Fletcher School last year, and I now work at Avison, the defense and aerospace consulting firm in DC. Modernization is the key word at the DoD now. That's what most people, including yourself, are talking about. And I guess my question is, given what looked to be flat defense budgets during the Biden administration, do you think Congress will provide the kind of flexibility that the DoD wants or needs to pursue its modernization and technology goals?
Well, I think that it's imperative that they do, but the DoD has to do a much better job of bringing the Congress inside the tent as a partner. And they need to start by creating a sense of urgency. And that means showing the Congress or key members all of the war games, the simulations that are saying, if you simply stay on the modernization path we're on now, and you don't figure out how to integrate these new technologies and capabilities, and you don't make the hard trade-offs, eventually the United States is going to lose its military technological edge. And because we've been talking for a decade about great power competition, but not changing how we operate or do business. We've lost a lot of time. So we're now in a situation where the next 4 years will impact the next 40. And if that doesn't get you sitting up and paying attention, so I think they've got to bring the Congress in, show them the analysis, show them the what and the why and the consequences of what this would mean for our ability to actually deter war with a power like China or Russia. And then help walk them through the trade-offs. And from that strategic perspective, why do we want to curtail this, platform buy in order to invest in the technologies that we're going to put on all those platforms to make them effective and survivable in this new contested environment? That's the hard work that has to be done with Congress.
Michèle, can I ask you a question? Is that going to require more funding? I mean, we're at $722 billion. We're the next, what is it, next top 5 or 8, depending, is spending relative to peers. Or is it a rebalancing that we're actually investing in the wrong? It's a rebalancing.
We have to spend smarter. I mean, even in times when the Defense Department is growing or the budget is growing, the Department of Defense always has more program than budget. They want to buy more than they can afford, no matter what the budget trends are, right? So the fact that with COVID, with the domestic requirements, with the need to rebuild other instruments of national power like the State Department and so forth, we're going to have to live with a constrained defense budget. I don't think we're going to see draconian cuts. I do think we're going to see a flattening because the Trump administration had forecast something like, 3 to 4% growth every year, on top of inflation. And so, so even if we flatten, that's enough to make the department feel constrained and force the hard choices. But it's going to have to be spending smarter. And I do think it's possible. And I think that's what this team, particularly, Deputy Secretary Hicks, Kathleen Hicks, has already started talking about exactly this issue in her guidance to the department so far.
Yeah, no, and it's not only Congress, but back to that civic education idea that if more Americans were aware about sort of how big the defense budget is, they're somehow aware of it, but the proportion of that's discretionary funding of the federal budget, then maybe Secretary Hicks and Congress can get support to do this rebalancing. So Robert Bell, you're our last questioner of the day. Welcome, Robert. It's nice to see you again.
See you.
Hello, Michèle. Michèle, I'm a 4th-year PhD candidate at Fletcher now. And my question concerns the part of the United Kingdom's defense review where they're going to increase the nuclear warhead loadings on their Trident boats. They officially said they're doing that because of concerns about Russia's missile defenses, both the upgrades of the Moscow ABM and the S-500. And we really haven't thought about strategic stability in terms of Russian ABM since the Richard Pearl days. Right. But I just wondered how you read this. Do you think it's as advertised, it has to do with Russian modernization of its missile defenses? Or do you think there's a China element that comes into this, that they're looking at other ways to project power to the Pacific other than just their aircraft carrier? Or do you think it's just post-Brexit make the UK great again?
I think it's a great question. When I first heard about it, I heard about it in terms of a larger stockpile as opposed to the uploading. And I thought, well, maybe that's just because they've had such a difficult time modernizing. And so they're going to anticipate, that this is going to have to last them a long time. So they want to have a bigger stockpile to work with to manage the the fact that they're not going to have major modernization again for a very long time. But then, you know, to your point, it also suggests that they're actually thinking about loading these things differently, which, you know, yes, there are concerns about what Russia is doing that, you know, will make things, you know, that complicate keeping deterrence stable. Yes, we're going to have, they've already announced in their defense white paper they want to put more focus on Indo-Pacific and China. But it was not something I expected. I don't have a definitive, clear view on exactly what their calculus is. But it is also, you know, it's generated a fair amount of concern from the arms control community, because I think one of the things we've been trying to do collectively for a very long time now is try to, even as we maintain a strong deterrent, have nuclear weapons, the role of nuclear weapons in our strategy recede, have them be on the back burner, be in the background, not be, you know, an instrument that any leader would think of early in a crisis or conflict, you know, thinking of them in terms of the very, 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 very last resort. And so, you know, I think it'll be interesting to you know, hear how they unpack this rationale further, because it is one of the points of the review that is going to get a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Thank you. So you brought us back to nuclear weapons, Bob, which is funny. So we've sort of come full circles. It's a nice way to sort of end our conversation here, Michèle. And we've covered a lot of ground. And I just want to thank you again. And I don't know, Dean Salamont, if you want to come back on and thank Michèle, but this has been fantastic. Again, thank you for all of your service. I'm sure you'll be back in at some point. And it's just wonderful that we have this expertise and that you had the time today to meet with us. So thank you very much, Michèle.
Thank you all for a great conversation. And as I said, I really do hope that many of you end up at least, you know, dipping your toe into public service, if not jumping in with both feet. So
with Monica's invitation, I can't put my video on, but I thank both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.